If you're familiar with SEP, which you obviously are, SEP has a number of different, we'll call them sub-features, if you will, that are part of its management stack, if you will. The ability to do firewalling, the ability to do advanced threat protection, right? It can actually quarantine based on things other than just individual threats, right? You can set up almost like little DLP rules in a way, right, to be able to do things. One of the features it has as well is something called host integrity. Host integrity is designed to kind of look at a set of binary variables, if you will. Based on whatever those are, it takes action, right? Usually that action is to change the location awareness, right? Or change a firewall policy or something like that. But realistically, it could be designed to do just about anything. So it looks at a set of parameters, executes accordingly, okay? So what are we trying to do here? We wanted to build a solution that took the SEP's ability to quarantine and isolate an endpoint and marry that to our ability to detect and understand the patch level of a system or series of systems, okay? So the quarantine enforcement essentially allows me to do just that, right? Make a determination from a CVE perspective, what is mandatory, what is required in this environment in order for you to be compliant. And if you're not, I want to take some action on it, okay? So in order to do this, we got to do a couple of things, and I'm going to walk you through all these, so don't worry about this slide directly here. But essentially, we need to set up two areas. One is in the SEP section itself, so we'll go into the SEPM, configure that. And then we need to go onto ITMS and actually set up a couple of pieces there, okay? So let's go ahead and jump into that, and then I'll walk you through the rest of the architecture that'll make a little bit more sense after you've kind of seen it in action, if you will. So we'll start with the SEPM, okay? So I've got a separate VM. It's running SEP Manager, right? There's nothing special going on here. This could be installed anywhere. It could be multiple SEPMs, however it works, okay? Within SEPM, you have a whole bunch of information available to you. We are going to start in the policies section, okay? The first thing you need to do is in policies, go to the host integrity section, and you need to either manipulate the default policy or create a new one. The default policy is perfectly acceptable, okay? So what we're going to do is crack this open, and you'll see inside the host integrity policy, the first thing we need to do is enable this. This is a little difficult to see on the screen, so let me know if you need me to clarify something for you. I can call it out a little bit better. On the requirements side, you'll see that there are a few options available to you on the actual host integrity piece. Do you want this thing to constantly be checking? Do you want it to sometimes check, or do you want it to never check, right? This is gonna seem a little counterintuitive at first. In our particular case, we don't care if it ever checks, right? For the purposes of the integration between ITMS and SEP, we don't care about the auto processing of host integrity, okay? We're concerned with the policy being enabled. Once that policy is enabled, we now have access to the APIs for host integrity via the SEPM. Does that make sense, what I just said there? Okay, keep in mind, if you're taking advantage of this feature right now, and you have other HI pieces in place currently, right? Whatever that may be, you're looking at register keys, you're doing anything with HI. The reason I'm kind of being a bit of a jerk about this is I don't want you to go in here and change all these settings because you'll break whatever HI stuff you're running currently in your environment, okay? So if this thing is currently not enabled, don't worry about it. Turn it on real quick, set it to never, and have a nice day. No need to even think twice about it. But if you get in there and take a look, or you're working with your SEP administrators and you see that those settings are already alive and there are some things happening there, just kind of proceed with caution, make sure you understand what you're doing, okay? All right. Once that's on, go ahead and click OK. We can get out of here. And then what we need to do is go set up a firewall policy. This one is where you're going to get yourself into trouble, if you do, okay? Now, again, we're having a conversation right now that kind of bridges the gap between traditional management operations and security enforcement, okay? Management operations, although they can cause damage, are generally forgiving, right? Worst case, if I deploy Office out to 50,000 people, yeah, I ate up the network and maybe I lost a couple hours of productivity, but it's not gonna necessarily brick everything. If I quarantine the entire company and no one has access to anything, we have a whole different set of problems. You might as well just go home, right? Just forget it, just go home at that point, right? So I say this not to scare you, but I say this in spend some time, understand what it is you're trying to do here, and make sure that you've got this nailed down. This is where you would want to engage folks from your security operations team, security response team, make sure everybody understands what these different pieces are and how they work. Everybody make sense on that one? Good? Okay. So Within SEP, if this is a clean installation, what you'll see under firewall policies are two policies here. One is the default firewall policy itself, right? This is the one SEP assigns to everybody when it just gets installed. And there is also a default quarantine firewall policy out of the box, right? This is the one where if you choose to use the quarantine feature, this is what will happen on those endpoints, okay? What I've done to make life easy is I've right-clicked on this and I've just copied it and cloned it, and I've created a new one called Altira's Quarantine Firewall Policy, okay? Just so I kind of understand what's going on there, all right? Within this firewall policy, you want to make sure it's turned on, meaning it's available. Okay, we haven't assigned it to anybody yet, so you're not going to hurt anything by turning the firewall policy on. Okay. In this rules section, this is where the magic is. Okay. I have added a line item just for the purposes of demonstration that give me full IP access to my notification server and my SEPM. Okay. That way, if I quarantine something and lock it out of the network, at least I can get to those two machines, okay? Which are what I need in order to do remediation. You with me so far? Okay. In a real world environment, yours is not gonna be this simple. I promise you, not even a little bit, right? You're gonna have site servers listed in here. You're gonna have task servers in here. You're gonna have a whole host of things that you need to understand, ports, protocols, all these other pieces. Yes, if you choose to, you can just open it wide up and say, my notification server is .130 and open all ports and have a nice day. If you're really doing this the way you should, you only want to open the ports that are required for remediation and baseline services, right? So if you want people to get to the software portal, open up the ports that allow you to get access to the software portal. If you have a separate software repository or a location where people run scripts, or a totally different Active Directory network, right? Any of those pieces are gonna come into this conversation. You wanna make sure that you have access to those, okay? Every port you open is gonna leave you that much more exposed to any other threat. Obviously that goes without saying, but keep that in mind. I ran into a situation a while ago where I was working with a university. There was an individual on the finance team, higher level individual, who for whatever reason had mandated to the entire network team that he needed access to the file share for all the financial documents, all of the student documents, all of this. He wanted admin rights to it. All right, whatever, see whatever. Let's go ahead and just give him access to that to keep him from bothering us, right? This guy got some ransomware, and that ransomware locked his drive and then proceeded to look for every single file share he had admin rights to, which happened to be the entire university's file share system, and locked the entire thing. Okay, bad juju when that stuff happens. So again, I say that to say, make sure you set these up the right way and make sure you only enable whatever permissions are necessary, okay? And again, that's all I'll say on that. Sound good? Okay. These firewall policies are pretty easy to mess with. You can create a new rule. The rules behave very similar to any old firewall, right? You give it a name. It wants, what services, has some out of the box. It's got some IP ranges and things like that. You'll kind of see how it works. This is a great place to kind of play in a demo network or a lab environment, right? And kind of see what to expect, okay? All right. Once that's done and you've got your firewall policy set up and ready to go, the next thing you need to do is go down to this client section, and this is where you need to kind of figure out how you want to group things. So within ITMS, we don't really have the concept of folder trees, of nested folders, if you will, right? It's not a hierarchical grouping. We have filters and targets, right? And those are just queries that dynamically run, and so you can be in any different group at any given time, right? It's irrelevant to us, right? It's all based on that math that dynamically occurs. SEP behaves more like Active Directory, right? So you've got a parent level, you've got children, and so on and so forth, right? Each one of those parent folder objects has the ability to have a policy associated with it. Okay, so you can set a quarantine policy at the global level. In other words, apply to every single client that this SEPM knows, or you can scope it down by an individual folder or group or whatever that is. Okay, again, you're probably familiar with that, but just in case you're not, kind of giving you a crash course on the SEP side. What I've done is created a new group, if you will. I've called it Quarantine Endpoints. This is just for me to be able to kind of play with, right, to see what's going on here. And this is where I'm going to bind those quarantine policies. That way, I don't run the risk of accidentally locking everybody in the entire company out of the network, okay? So I've created this. I've added this Win10 box to this particular group here. And now I'm going to go into this policies section, and you can do a couple of things. If you want this to inherit itself from the top down, in other words, we're going to apply this global policy, you can. In my case, since I'm using just this individual one, I don't want to do that. So I'm going to uncheck this, and there's two places I need to look. The first one is this host integrity policy right here. You should see host integrity policy. It probably says shared in this case. If you click on this, You can edit the shared one, or you can create a new one if you want to. This is where it's getting that host integrity policy we enabled a few minutes ago, right? And then down below, the only other thing you need to worry about right here is this quarantine policies when host integrity fails. So in the event I hit this host integrity problem, right, my 0 turns into a 1, what do you want me to do? I want you to use this firewall policy, which is the one we just created a few minutes ago. Everybody with me? Okay. Very simple. That's it. And that's, at the end of the day, that's all you have to do to get the SEPM itself configured, right? Very straightforward. A couple of caveats here. SEPM and SEP don't behave quite the same way Altiris do, but one thing they do share is they have this concept of a push-pull that exists, right? So by default, your SEPM is set up to do, I think it's a 30-minute heartbeat out of the box between the clients, okay? When you go through this quarantine process, if ITMS finds something, because it's using an API to communicate with the SEPM directly, that's going to happen right now, okay? Your clients, however, may not actually be aware of that because they're talking to their SEPM potentially every 30 minutes. So by default, you may see some inconsistencies as to when these quarantine policies actually kick in by design on the SEPM side, right? That's a load question. It's something you need to kind of make a determination internally how you want that set up. You'll see in here that you can change this from push to pull. You can change the heartbeat from 30 minutes to 5 minutes. So you can adjust all those timings there. But as you're setting this up and as you're test driving this in the environment, just keep that in mind, right? If you do something and you notice that it doesn't happen as quick as you expected it to, the SEPM is likely the place to look for in terms of how that behaves. Got it? Okay. All right. So that's the end of that on the SEPM. Let's go over to the S&P itself now. So from here, we need to go to settings. We're going to go to the Endpoint Protection Manager, and we are going to set up the actual connection from ITMS to the SEPM. Okay. Now, most of you probably have multiple SEPMs in the environment, right? It's highly unlikely you have one, but you might. This number right here, this list, if I click on add in the drop down, gets populated based on an inventory scan. Okay, this is not a text field where you type in, this is the location of my SEPM and this is the port and the credentials and go forward. Can anybody tell me why we chose to do that way? Anybody have a guess as to why that is? That's okay. So say I have 10,000 devices in my environment. Okay, and I have 5 SEPMs, right? So 2,000 on each one. If I were to just give you the ability to type in that single SEPM directly and hard code it, how would I know which client's attached to which SEPM at that point? It would actually make life a little difficult. The next step would have to be, okay, well, interrogate the SEPM, tell me which clients are there, right? And then try to match that up. Since we're using an inventory scan, we can actually scan that SEP client on the endpoint and we can figure out exactly which SEPM it's reporting to and then populate it right there in the list. Then we don't have to do any magic at all. You just give me the credentials for it and I can sort out who goes where at that point, right? So just so you know, inventory scan is what needs to be set up there in order for that to pop up, okay? Once it's added, you can see I've got mine listed here. The next thing down below is the quarantining message itself, okay? If I click on this, you have the ability to customize this however you want. This is what you're gonna see out of the box. I added that pre and active on there, just to show that you can edit this. This could say whatever, right? Go home, you're fired, right? If you want, or take the day off because you're quarantined. Whatever you wanna put in here is what would be appropriate. Currently, this only supports text. We do have a line item there to maybe make this a little more HTML sexy if we wanted to at some point. But for now, it's just going to be a text message that pops up on the client's computer, and you'll actually see what that looks like. Okay? All right. Once this is done, we actually have to go create the quarantine policy itself, and you see there's a link there. You'll notice in the policies section, we have a new folder in here for integrations. This is where you'll see the control compliance suite pieces along with the Symantec endpoint protection ones. If you want to upload the SEP packages to deploy those, this is where you would find that location there, right? All that other hygiene stuff kind of lives here, okay? So we're going to right click. Let me scoot this over a little bit so you can see it. We'll right click on the quarantine side. We'll create a new policy, okay? Policy is just like anything else, right? I'll go ahead and name this one. We'll call it Chicago Symantec Endpoint Protection Quarantine Policy. We're good to go. And now we have a few pieces of information we need to go ahead and fill out in here. The first one is the CVE, okay? This is gonna get a little tricky for you if you're not familiar with CVEs and kind of how this process works, okay? In patch management, everything we look at is looking at a bulletin, if you will, some kind of published KB, right? So Adobe says, hey, there's a problem with Acrobat 11.5, KB 1234 will fix that, or there's a feature update for it, or there just was a bug in the UI, so KB 127 fixes that, right? That's kind of how that world works. In the security world, you look at things from a slightly different set of context, right? You've got this concept of CVE. CVE says somebody could take control of this system using this particular exploit, and it applies to Windows 10, Linux, Apache, these 30 different environments, right, is what it applies to. So it looks slightly different when you're looking at a CVE, okay? Usually when you get to this point, if you're trying to quarantine somebody or trying to set up a quarantine policy, you're likely aware of what the CVE is that's a problem, right? So, the news pops up, says there's this thing called WannaCry running around. You Google it. The CVE for WannaCry is 2018-976. Okay, cool. Come in here, click the button, and I don't have to think anything twice about it, okay? If for some reason you don't know what that is and you're curious what CVEs apply to an endpoint, there is a way in the patch management engine to actually look at individual patches themselves and see what CVEs they're associated with. And we do have an enhancement request at some point, to kind of generate a correlation report between those. But just kind of go with me on this one so far. So since we're going to be playing with this Windows 10 device that I have, I know that it has a few CVEs that apply to it right now. So CVE 2017 11927 is one that applies. You'll notice it's listed here a few times. That's because there are 3 separate instances of it. Depending on the platform, it's the same CVE, right? So we'll clean that up as well and make sure that only shows up once. So I went ahead and added that. I'm going to add one more. This one is going to be CVE 2018 and 0765. Okay, same thing. We'll go ahead and click that. There you go. So I'm starting this policy off, one second, saying if these 2 CVEs are missing on this endpoint, quarantine it. Okay? Yashim. You sure? Okay, you're fine. If it comes back up, just scream. All right. After we've got our CVE list, now we need to figure out who it applies to, right? So we got to target it at somebody here. This could be anybody, right? Could be just the finance team, could be sales, could be everybody in the company. However you want to play this game, you're more than welcome to. I will tell you, earlier, during the webinar panel, a couple of the customers had mentioned that hygiene, task hygiene, policy hygiene, database hygiene, target hygiene, all those other things are really important. I can tell you that they're infinitely more important if you're playing with this, okay? The last thing you want to do is have 17 million quarantine policies in here and try to figure out why endpoint 3 is quarantined and have to dig through all of those, right? There is a way to look that up. You will be able to see it. I don't want to scare everybody there, but this is definitely an area where you want to make sure you keep track of everything that's going on, right? Because again, the ramifications are big there. So we're going to click apply to. We'll go to targets. This can be, whatever target you pick at this point. I'm just going to grab this Windows 10 one that I built earlier. All this is doing is targeting that single Windows 10 box is all it is. Click OK. And now I can scroll down, and I think it was Jesse was mentioning that there's this grace period option that exists down here. This is where you would set that. So enable the policy, send it to the endpoint, but I do not want you to take any action on this thing until, let's say, November 15th, right? That gives everybody, 20 days to actually get this patch installed, right? Makes sense to be able to do that. As much as you want to quarantine everybody right now, very rarely are you going to be in a position where you say, we're stopping business until this gets fixed. There may be some situations where that is the case, but most of the time you'll set a grace period for, a couple of days, a week, 2, whatever that may be, okay? All right, I'll go ahead and undo this right now. I'm going to save this real quick. You'll notice it's going to pop up and say, hey, I'm about to evaluate all this information, and anybody who's not compliant is going to get quarantined. Are you sure you want to do this? So it's warning you. I'm going to click OK. This policy is disabled, so even though it's saying that, it's not actually doing anything yet, okay? Now let me explain to you what's going on here. The CVE list we have is a list that we maintain in there. It comes from the patch database, comes from a couple of different places, right? So we have access to that CVE list. The evaluation that occurs against the endpoints is not something that is done in real time. So I want you to keep that in mind. It is based on the patch assessment scan. So if your patch assessment scans run every 6 months, these CVEs are going to be that current against that endpoint, right? That thing could have been patched, months ago and you wouldn't know about it, okay? Almost everybody in this room should be doing compliance scans at least every half hour, 4 at the longest, maybe twice a day, worst possible case, okay? So just keep that in mind. This data is based on what is in the database, not necessarily what the endpoint is currently looking at, okay? It could be a few hours old, okay? All right. Now that that's done, let's go back over to our Win10 box, right? Let's double check a couple of things here. Open up some command prompts, see what we got going on. So you can see internet's working just fine. Google's working fine, right? So we got full internet access, everybody's good to go, okay? Switch back to our SMP. My policy's staged and ready to go here. Let's go ahead and turn it on. We'll scroll down, we'll save it. Okay, again, hey, you're about to do this evaluation. So now that it's saved and active, it ran through the database, it's parsing everything, it's looking at that particular client saying, hey, these are my 2 CVEs. Does this client say that it doesn't have them? If so, take action, right? Go back to my Windows 10 box and you'll notice immediately I've got this message from the ITMS administrator, right, saying, hey, you're about to get quarantined. This is my pre-quarantine message that's popping up right now, okay? Now, I've got an architecture slide that'll explain this to you. It's going to seem a little cross-eyed for a minute. The message you're seeing on the screen is coming from ITMS. It's coming from the notification server, okay? The quarantine itself happens with the SEPM, okay? So you've got 2 different processes from 2 different systems theoretically running in parallel. You will likely run into a situation where the message gets to the endpoint before the SEPM has a chance to actually quarantine the endpoint because of that push-pull conversation I was talking about a few minutes ago, right? Totally normal, okay, for that to happen. If that doesn't work for you, you just need to increase that push-pull or at least set your SEPM to push at that point, and that'll happen a lot quicker at that point, okay? All right. So, hey, you're about to get quarantined. You'll notice here that this is not a Windows message bubble that pops up, right? One of the concerns we had when we were having this conversation is, oh, let's just make it a bubble. Well, what happens if I'm in the bathroom while this thing's going on, or at lunch or something like that, right? And the message pops up saying, hey, you're about to get quarantined, and then it just disappears, right? Not good. We need these end users to know this is going to happen, and this message will not go away unless they physically acknowledge it. Okay, I'm clicking okay, right? So there really is no excuse for somebody to not know they're about to get quarantined, okay? All right, now that that's done, here in a couple of seconds, the next message will pop up, but it's likely that we've actually gone into quarantine mode at this point. So let's go ahead and ping Google again. And you'll notice it's failing at this point, right? So I've flipped. I'm full on quarantined at this point. If we go to, it should try to load MSN, it's probably gonna bomb. Won't work. Yep, so it's dead. Okay, within SEP, if we open this up, you'll notice it's got a flag. And what you didn't see, because I wasn't able to flip it fast enough, is SEP actually does pop up a message as well saying host integrity failed. So there is another layer of messaging that occurs when this actually happens, okay? Since I don't have any, well, I have admin rights to this particular instance of SEP. Your end users shouldn't, right? So they shouldn't be able to take anybody out of quarantine or do anything like that. They're essentially locked out right now. This firewall policy is in place, okay? This is why right now, going back to my conversation around that firewall policy, if you put a line item in there that says don't talk to the SEPM, well, you're quarantined forever now. Enjoy it, right? There's no way to actually talk to the SEPM and unquarantine somebody. Make sense? Okay. Any questions at this point before we keep going forward? Everybody good? Keeping up? Okay. Start here. Good question. Any components within SEP that are required for this to actually function correctly? The firewall, for sure, has to be there. And I believe HI is actually part of the native SEP installation. I don't think it's part of the proactive threat protection or anything like that. So once that gets enabled, it becomes part of the stack. But the firewall is the big one. And there are some customers that do not have that firewall enabled, in which case you wouldn't be, the HI process would work. It just would never actually quarantine itself, if that makes sense. Yeah, great question. Next. That's a great question. So Mark was asking, can I trigger it off a certain patch or a certain CVE? At this point, it's a CVE that we focused on right there. There are some, potentially legitimate use cases why you would want to say, KB1234, which happens to be Java 02. I want to quarantine somebody. But at the moment, we decided to limit this to CVE just because the security teams tend to kind of speak that CVE language. But that is something we're kind of playing with there. But yeah, it's a great question. Yeah. It's a fantastic question. I don't think everybody heard that. The question was, When this actually occurs, I'm now quarantined. You'll notice I opened up IE, page can't be displayed, right? It almost looks like the network cable's unplugged, right? Because the firewall just bricked the thing is what's going on. The question is, couldn't I redirect this or provide some form of potentially self-remediation available to the endpoint? The answer to that currently is no, but that is exactly what we were wanting to do, is to be able to do that. And so whether that's through that messaging piece that you saw, or we actually open that message in a browser style context and give somebody access to the software portal, there's a number of different ways we've talked about doing that self-remediation. There are some instances too where there may be a reason why you quarantine somebody, there may not even be remediation available. And in which case you'd have a message saying, hey, there's nothing you can do, contact the help desk, right? But what you're describing right there, that's where the power of having an enforcement point like SEP and a remediation and management point like ITMS come into play, is being able to take advantage of that exact style scenario. So no, but yes, that's exactly what we want to be able to do, is that self-remediation style approach, right? Especially if it's something that's available. Great question. Yeah. Again, if you folks didn't hear it on the other side of the room, say I get quarantined and I go home, right? Maybe I'm not aware that I got quarantined, right? The policy got there or whatever's happening, and I just didn't know that was going on. I get home, I plug everything in, I'm locked out of everything at this point, right? Because I'm totally quarantined. I remediate myself, or some other remediation process occurs, and normally I would not be quarantined anymore. How does that work, right? There's a kicker to this conversation in that ITMS has a cloud-enabled management gateway, right? So we have the ability, we could care less where you are, right? As long as you have an internet connection, we can talk to you just fine. The issue becomes the SEPM at that point. If your SEPM, which it likely is inside the network, it will not be able to talk to that client to unquarantine it. We are looking into the future, and there's some reasons why you wouldn't want to do this, but we're looking into the future of a way of bypassing the SEPM, right, or working with it in tandem so that we can kind of control that quarantine process and notify the SEPM so that it becomes a non-issue. Additionally, and if those of you who have had conversations with our SEP team, SEP has some roadmap items available, in going to the cloud there. SEP is looking to add this same style of functionality into that cloud instance that they're developing right now, codenamed Evergreen, Symantec 1. You probably may have heard some of those terms there before. When that's available, that would become a non-issue at that point. You can go down that road. But to directly answer your question, it could potentially be a problem in that case, one that we are looking to try to figure out how to solve. There are just some nuances to how that would work. But yeah, it's a great question. So on the other side of the room, SEP has this location awareness concept, right? Where it can say, all right, you're on subnet XYZ, therefore apply this particular firewall policy or this set of policies, right? When you're not on this subnet, i.e. you go home, I don't care where you go at that point, right? Knock yourself out. Will that have any effect on this? And the answer to that is absolutely not. Once host integrity kicks in, the answer to everything is no, because host integrity said no. So unless that end user has some form of admin rights to the endpoint, they could uninstall the SEP agent. That's an option that they potentially would have, which would, eliminate the quarantine at that point. Or there is an ability to go in there and actually turn that off again if you have administrative control over that endpoint. There's not really anything we can do about that. But no, that location awareness will not function the way you would expect it to on purpose, because host integrity has failed at that point. Okay? All right. So now that we've done this, we've locked this person out, right? Now, Mark's called, right? Because Mark's mad at me. He said, why'd you quarantine me, right? So no big deal. I log a help desk ticket and I come back in here and I want to fix this, right? We have a report built in that'll show you the status of these quarantine options here. So you can see I've got the computer name Win10, right, is listed up here. You can see the OS name. You can see the missing CVE IDs, right? So what CVEs are associated with this particular quarantine policy. You'll notice there's no grace period here. You can see what action has been taken and what the success of that is. So in other words, we quarantined this one successfully. We're good to go, right? Again, Mark's on the phone. Hey, Mark, you know what? No problem. Let me right click on this real quick. I need to exclude you from this policy. It'll as soon as I right click on that Win10 box, it will show me all of the quarantine policies that apply to this one, right? Whether or not they're active is a different argument, but it'll say 47 quarantine policies, right, have Win10 listed in there, right? So which one of these do you want to pull Mark out of? Well, in this case, I want to pull him out of this one. So I click OK. Yes, we're going to go through that evaluation period one more time. As I run this, you'll notice it's going to take the action of doing what we call a reverse quarantine, right? So it's going back to that host integrity API and saying, hey, Mark's good to go, take him out of this list. And you'll notice if we go back to the Win10 box, you can see the active message finally showed up, right, saying you're actively quarantined. But you'll notice in the background right here, it actually shows green. So it took him out of quarantine at that point, right? And now I should be able to go wherever I need to at that point, right? No problem. MSN's working just fine. Obviously, our ping should work without any issues. Have a nice day, right? It's that simple to unquarantine somebody in that particular situation, okay? What's happening behind the scenes, if I go back to the SMP itself and I go back to my actual policy here, you can see this is the one we're looking at. Let's go ahead and refresh this, which it might take me to the report page. Yep, that's okay. So we'll go back to policies. We'll go to integrations, endpoint protection. This is the policy we created right here. And you can see down here, add computers for exclusion. That right-click action just explicitly listed that resource in the exclusion section, right? Once it's in there, every time the policy gets saved, that policy will reevaluate itself, right? So by adding that Win10 box in there and saving it, I effectively unquarantined Mark at that point. It really is that simple, right? And if for some reason that was a mistake, I just delete him out of that exclusions and he'll get quarantined all over again, right? That's how the loop works, okay? Yes? So when a device is quarantined, will it still attempt to run patch? And the answer to that is whatever local executables are there, whatever local policies are there, whatever binary, anything like that will run like normal. If the thing needs to reach out to the SMP or to a side server or anything like that, unless you allowed that in the firewall, it will not be able to do anything, which is why that firewall policy is so important to soak the right way, right? So getting the notification server is easy, but if the patch is coming from a site server or something like that and you can't get to the site server, you just caused yourself a problem, right? So you need to make sure you got everybody lined up appropriately there. Does that answer your question? Perfect. Okay, anybody else? Good to go? Okay, all right. So, $1 million question again. Is this something you feel like is useful? Is this something you think you'd be able to take advantage of in your environment? I mean, with the security people that you work with, hopefully you do work with some of those folks. Do you think they'd see some advantage in being able to do something like this? Show of hands. Okay, great, great. Well, as you get into this, if you have any questions or thoughts or anything like that, or you see some areas where you might be able to improve that, you know, as always, we love that feedback, and you know, we'll take that into consideration and take a look at what we can. Okay. All right. I got one more thing to show you, and then I think we're good to go to call it a day. Yeah. Minimum required version of SEP. Thank you. Let's go ahead and pop this guy up here real quick. So here you go, right here. So as Russ mentioned, you need patch management, obviously, right? Because that's where we're going to get the patch information from. Inventory has to be there because that's where the scan itself actually occurs. And SEP is 14 on up. 14.2.0 is not supported. You need MP, what is it, MP1 or MP2? I think it's MP2. MP1, excuse me. And the reason for that is there is a registry key we were looking for on the SEP side, and for whatever reason the SEP team just had a bug, if you will, and that registry key was omitted. So you need to upgrade to that MP1 in order to get that registry key back in order for this to function. But essentially it's 14 across the board is what you're looking at there in order for that to work correctly. One of the things we talked about doing is, you know, in the event those CVEs, since we're, you know, pulling them from that area, you know, there should be an option to even click a box and just say, well, just fix it, right? Because, I mean, they're locked out anyway, right? And so that is something that's on the roadmap. We'll get to it, just baby steps at the time there. But yeah, great question.
To learn more, visit go.symantec.com/manage.